Okay.
I think you're good to get started.
Thank you. Welcome. I'm Peggy Creer. I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County, who is co-sponsoring tonight's program along with the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan grassroots organization that was formed in 1920. That was the year the 19th Amendment passed. And from the beginning, the League's mission was to promote voting, but also to promote broader civic engagement, the work between elections to hold public officials accountable and to advocate for public policies that serve the common good. To help maximize voter civic engagement, we've assembled experts here tonight who can help navigate the barriers to full participation in our democracy. I've noticed that there's been a bump in voter registrations this summer. So I'm hoping that on November 8th, midterm elections, we will surpass the turnout that we saw in 2018, which was 58% of voter age population in Wisconsin. I invite you to check out the League's voter resource website, which is vote411.org. That website, it has customized information for each voter. It includes what's on your ballot, where you go to vote, how to request an absentee ballot, including definitions of elected offices and responses from candidates to questions that have been posed by the League of Women Voters. The statewide offices are on vote411.org right now. Local offices will be added in about a week. Tonight's panelists are experts on voting rights and disability rights. I'm going to introduce all of them up front and they'll give their presentations in the order I introduced them in now. And then after their presentations, we'll open it up for questions. Please put your questions in the chat, but it would be helpful if you could hold off until near the end of the presentations in case your question is addressed in one of the presentations, and we'll take questions then. My fellow League member, Lorna Grady, is helping to monitor the chat, and Eileen Newcomer, who's the voter education manager for the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, is our Zoom master working behind the scenes tonight. So first we will have Barbara Beckert, who is Director of External Advocacy with Disability Rights Wisconsin, followed by Denise Jess, Executive Director of the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired, then Scott Thompson, Staff Counsel at Law Forward, and then Dorothy Dean, founder and CEO.
Oh, they're going to have to wait.
So Barbara, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peggy. Eileen, you can go ahead and bring up the PowerPoint. And it's so wonderful to be here with you today. And we so value the great partnership with the League of Women Voters, and the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County has a special place in my heart as a member and a resident of Milwaukee County, and grateful for the partnership we've had with you for so many years. So I'm Barbara Beckert with Disability Rights Wisconsin and the Wisconsin Disability Vote Coalition. Next slide, please. And it's my pleasure to be here tonight along with my advocacy partner, Denise Jess, to talk with you about a very important and timely topic, the struggle that is going on in our country and in Wisconsin in particular about equitable access to voting for people with disabilities. And I use the tagline and update from the front lines because we are on the front lines working with voters, and sometimes it feels like we're on the battle line because it's been a very difficult and contentious time. So in our initial remarks, we'll talk about a little bit about the disability vote, historical barriers and new barriers, some of the strategies we're using to protect and defend voting rights. Denise will talk about knowing your rights, voting rights and accessibility, and resources. Next slide. A few quick remarks about my agency. Disability Rights Wisconsin is the federally mandated protection and advocacy system for Wisconsin, and our charge is to protect the rights of people with disabilities, including voting rights. And that charge comes right from the Help America Vote Act. Protection and advocacy agencies across the country play that role. We do have a voter hotline and we're open year round, not only on election day. So just know we're available to be a resource for you and others in the community. I also wanted to mention the Disability Vote Coalition. Next slide. We are a nonpartisan effort. We do a lot of education and training, a lot of it collaboratively with the league. It's coordinated by Disability Rights Wisconsin and the Board for People with Developmental Disabilities. And we welcome membership, both of agencies. We have a lot of partners around the state, as well as individuals. And our focus is ensuring that people with disabilities have the opportunity to fully participate in the electoral process, and that they understand and are able to assert their rights. Next screen. So what is a disability vote? People often ask, what are the numbers? What do you mean by disability? So approximately 23% of the people who voted in November 2020 were individuals with some type of disability, according to the American Association for People with Disabilities. And the CDC estimates that about 26% of adults have some type of disability. So it's a significant number of people. It's also a diverse group. People often, when they think of disability, they might think of a mobility issue or a wheelchair, but it's also people with sensory disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities, all kinds of physical disabilities, some invisible disabilities, mental health disabilities, for example, complex medical needs, and chronic health conditions. So a very diverse group. A lot of older adults have disabilities acquired through aging. Often they don't think of themselves or formally identify as a person with a disability, but have some of those same restrictions, mobility, vision, hearing loss, and so on. People with disabilities are a group that's underrepresented at the polls. Rutgers has a great program where they periodically do a study about the turnout of voters with disabilities. And they talk about the disability gap. And that is the gap between the number of people who are eligible to vote and those who actually turn out. So our goal is to close that gap here in Wisconsin, and we welcome your partnership in doing so. Next slide. So historically, here are some of the major barriers, and they may be familiar to you. Accessibility concerns. DRW actually does audits of polling places on election day for the Election Commission, and we see firsthand, we continue to see accessibility concerns at polling places. Lack of photo ID. Wisconsin has one of the most restrictive photo ID laws in the country. A high percentage of people with disabilities are non-drivers, and by the way, 30% of adults in Wisconsin are non-drivers. So this is a barrier for a lot of people. And if you're a non-driver, you don't have transportation, while we do have a state ID for non-drivers, it can be difficult to get the transportation to get that state ID. DMV hours are limited. They aren't open in the evenings or in the weekends. And if you need accessible transportation, it's especially difficult to get there. Failure to provide accommodations. There are a lot of disability-related accommodations, and Denise will be discussing those in detail, but they may not be provided. People may need an accommodation and be turned down. We certainly get calls at the hotline about someone who needs assistance filling out their ballot, and the poll worker tells them, no, you fill out that ballot yourself or you don't get to vote. That's not an unusual thing. And we all also know that a lot of people don't know their rights. They don't know that they're entitled to accommodations. So that's part of our mission. Limited access to internet and technology. We still have a digital divide in our country, and it certainly affects a lot of people with disabilities, often those who live in a congregate setting like a group home or a nursing home. We think everyone has a smartphone, but just like everyone doesn't have a driver's license, not everyone has access to technology. Housing insecurity. Unfortunately, we see a lot of people with disabilities having to move frequently. Our long-term care system right now is in a lot of turmoil. So if you live in a group home or an adult family home, you may move often, and you may have challenges with having to register to vote again, establish residency, and so on. Lack of training for poll workers. And along with that, confusion about voting rights. And a couple groups of people who we particularly see that with, people under guardianship, often don't know if they have the right to vote. People with criminal convictions often are unsure as well, and fearful. People are fearful. They don't want to break the law. We hear a lot about people breaking the law with voting, but in the experience we have, people want to follow the law, and so they may be reluctant to vote because they're not sure if they have the right to do so. So we're all here to try and assist them with that, as I know the league is. And finally, stigma and discrimination. That can be a factor as well. Someone going to vote and being told, you know, I don't think you're eligible to vote. Well, we know that only a judge can take away the right to vote. A poll worker cannot, a family member cannot, but some people think they have the authority to do that, and people are intimidated. Next slide. So we saw some new barriers in Wisconsin and nationally since the 2020 election. We had a tsunami of bills that proposed new barriers and restrictions on voting. And many of those bills seem to disproportionately impact people with disabilities. And I think that's because in particular, they targeted absentee voting. So that affected people with disabilities in a lot of different ways. I won't read through the whole list because I'm going to talk about those more in just a minute. And I know we have limited time. There have been so many investigations. It's become confusing to keep track of all the investigations we've had, even though we know that the 2020 election was an election that was accurate, that was secure, that really was pretty admirable given the fact that it went on in a pandemic. There still continues to be misinformation and allegations about voter fraud. And we see investigations that continue to this day, even though some of them, such as the Gableman investigation, have stopped. A couple of areas that have been the target include voting rights of people in nursing homes. And of course, many of those are people with a disability. Also indefinitely confined voters, people who need to vote absentee all the time. That has also been under attack in Wisconsin. We've also seen attacks on election officials and the integrity of our elections, and so much litigation, which I know Scott will be discussing in his remarks, but that's been confusing because it means that the law and the way we run elections continues to change. So frequent changes in Wisconsin, that's one thing you can count on. Next screen. Whoops, I think you went to screen. Yep. So these are examples of some of the bills that we saw move forward through the legislature. And I just wanted to note that because of the dynamics of the landscape, the political landscape in Wisconsin, although a number of bills that would have negatively impacted people with disabilities did move forward with a majority and were approved in the legislature, none of these bills have become law in our state because our governor is able to veto bills. We don't know what the landscape will be like in the future. So big question mark there. But just a few examples of the restrictions. New restrictions were proposed for indefinitely confined voters. For example, people would no longer be able to get absentee ballots automatically for every election. Well, that's kind of the point of the statute, is to help people who need to always vote absentee. Limited who could assist with returning an absentee ballot. New restrictions on use of drop boxes. Prohibiting clerks from correcting a defect on a completed absentee ballot. Would be a felony for nursing home staff to offer assistance with voting to residents. So none of those bills have become law. Next slide. Well, we've tried different strategies to protect and defend voting rights in this challenging time. Next slide. We've tried to elevate the voice of voters impacted. I think that that is the most important, to hear directly from people whose voting rights, whose civil rights are at risk. Ensure that we have testimony at legislative hearings and election commission meetings. It's very important to not miss those opportunities. Press events, getting accurate information out through the media is so important. Sign on statements where there's been an issue where we felt it was important to speak out. we've rallied around with our allies, including the League of Women Voters, to get a statement out. Letters to the editor, earned media, that's been very important. Voter statements, surveys of voters, getting their feedback. What do they think of the proposed bills? Social media, including voter spotlights. And for this process, our agency and the coalition have provided legislative analysis, support, and advocacy training, because there's a lot to keep track of and to support people with. Next slide. So finally, training and outreach is really important. A few of the themes that we focused on: knowing your rights, education about federal and state laws, and Denise is going to talk about that in a minute. Guardianship and voting rights. We just had a major training on that yesterday. We had over 200 people hearing about how people under guardianship who've lost their right to vote can have it restored. We've got some great new resources. Voting rights of people with criminal convictions. It was great to team up with Eileen to train community corrections staff about restoration of voting rights, to talk with people in their care. Collaboration with the league has been something that we've done on a lot of fronts. Voting rights of care facility residents, we've done a lot of training on that. And partnering with the Election Commission to provide resources and training on accessibility and accommodations, including clerk training on accessible polling places. Next slide. And coalition work and partnership has been so important, including with some of you who are on this Zoom. So I am going to turn it over now, if you want to go to the next slide, to great advocacy partner and leader, Denise Jess. If you want to take it away from here, Denise, it's all yours.
You bet, Barbara. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for attending tonight. Again, my name is Denise Jess. I'm the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired, and I am a person who lives with blindness. I'm a proud member of the Wisconsin Disability Vote Coalition and also a member of the Wisconsin Elections Commission Accessible Advisory Committee. So just a brief word about my organization for those of you who may not be familiar with us. We are a 70-year-old statewide serving organization with a mission to promote the dignity and empowerment of the people of Wisconsin living with vision loss through advocacy, education, and vision services. And the greatest number of folks that we are seeing experiencing vision loss are our older adults, through diseases like macular degeneration, glaucoma, and retinopathy due to diabetes. The values that guide our work are inclusivity, uncompromising respect, and integrity. And I hope that you might visit us at our website at wcblind.org to learn more about our work. And also our 800 phone number is there. Eileen, you can go ahead. So I am really pleased to talk with you about the rights of voters with disabilities, and whether you are a person with disabilities yourself, knowing your rights so that you can advocate for them, set expectations that these rights be afforded to you. If you are an ally, a voting rights advocate overall, or a poll worker, elections official, these rights are really important to understand so that you can help uplift our ability to exercise them. The first is that as voters with disabilities, we have a right to vote privately and independently. And some of the barriers that Barbara heightened in her overview really often get in the way of us being able to fulfill this right. Just a very concrete example: Wisconsin does not have an accessible absentee ballot, a screen reader one that could be sent, the ballot could be sent electronically. So during the pandemic, I was unable to vote privately and independently because I cannot visibly see the ballot and be able to mark it confidently because of the itty bitty print. And I required having someone in my household, either my wife or one of my adult daughters, read me the ballot and mark it on my behalf. And while I was very grateful for their assistance and state law that allows for that assistance, it was very much felt like my privacy and independence were compromised because I could not complete my own ballot. We also have the right to access the polling place, including having an accessible route into the polling place. And in Wisconsin, where it snows, and it could be snowing in November, this includes proper snow removal. We have the right to assistance in mailing or returning our ballot. And this has just been very recently affirmed. And I think Scott will talk more about this in the Casey versus Weck decision that was recently noted in federal district court. We also have the right to have assistance in marking our ballot, whether at home or in a care facility or at a polling place. And we have the right to choose who that assister is, whether it's a family member or a dear friend or even a poll worker. I did a press conference this morning and noted the importance of poll workers marking the ballot on the behalf of the voter's request and according to the voter's direction. And a woman came up to me afterwards and thanked me because as a poll worker, she did not know that she had both the obligation and the opportunity to mark that ballot. The only people who are not able to assist with marking the ballot are the voter's employer or union steward or someone who is on the ballot directly. Eileen, you can go forward. Additional rights for those of us with disabilities is we have the right to use an accessible voting machine. And there's images on the right-hand side of the express vote, which is used in many municipalities around the state. Accessible voting equipment is, in my mind, it's liberating. I am able to independently vote by inserting the ballot. I wear a set of headphones because I use the screen reader feature. So I hear everything that is on the ballot. You'll see in the lower image, the controller or Braille keypad, and I'm able to utilize that to mark the ballot by pressing those arrow keys. Everything is read to me. I can check my ballot. And I will even say during the partisan primary, being able to use this equipment was amazing because once I made my party selection, I was only offered the candidates that were in that party, thus decreasing the likelihood of needing to spoil the ballot if I'd mismarked it. So that this equipment needs to be set up according to Wisconsin law, available in every single polling place in the state. And it needs to be tested, turned on, properly programmed, and ready to go when the polls open. Let's see, the law doesn't apply to absentee voting, but I know the city of Madison will have these machines available for in-person absentee balloting, which is great because it helps to acclimate the general voting public to the ease of use of these machines. Anyone can use these machines. They are not regulated or restricted to people with disabilities. We often hear poll workers say things like, oh, that machine is for those people, air quotes around those, meaning those of us with disabilities. But as a voter, you have the right to use that equipment, whether or not you have a disability. And we really encourage you to do that because it helps really lift up the value of this equipment and bring it to greater awareness of our elections officials and poll workers. You can learn more about the accessible voting equipment that is available in Wisconsin at the Wisconsin Elections website at the link that's given on your screen. The state municipalities get to choose their equipment based on what has been approved by the Elections Commission, and there are approximately six different versions of voting equipment in the state. Eileen, we can move forward. Thank you. Voters have right to curbside voting if they cannot enter the polling place because of disability, and this is under Wisconsin statute. We recommend that if you would intend to use curbside voting, that you contact your clerk and make a plan for how to do this successfully. Some polling places will have you honk if you need curbside voting. Others will have you call a phone number. So really working that out with your clerk so you know the procedure they're using and they know to expect you at some point during the election day for curbside voting. And you can move forward. We also have the right to reasonable accommodations. And one of the things that the Wisconsin Elections Commission does is provide a polling place supply kit. So if you need to be able to use a chair to sit down, you have a right to use a signature guide. For someone like me, signing the poll book in the accurate place is extremely difficult. And so and I have missigned the poll book on more than one occasion. And so a signature guide really sets is a plastic device where I sign inside the opening in the plastic device. The poll worker places it in the poll book in the exact right place. And then I successfully have signed the poll book. My polling place uses the signature guide for every single voter, and the general response is we love this thing because it just makes sure that everybody signs in the correct place. So voters in general are responding really positively to the signature guide. There should also be magnifying glasses available. And if you need assistance in stating your name and address, you have the right to that. And there should be tools on board to support voters who are deaf or hard of hearing, like pens and paper or an easel pad. And we can go forward. On the Disability Vote website, there is a Know Your Voting Rights video, and the link is here for you as well. We invite you to take a look at that video and share it with folks in your circle, because it does an excellent job of summarizing a lot of what we're talking about tonight. And then there's also a voting rights fact sheet. And we can go forward. So I want to take my last few minutes to cover guardianship. So in Wisconsin, a person who is under guardianship retains the right to vote unless it is explicitly removed by the court. So elections officials, family members, guardians, and others may not be the people who tell the voter they cannot vote. It really has to be that specific court order. The court's decision regarding the right to vote is noted on a court form called determination and order on petition for guardianship due to incompetence. The court order will not say directly that the voter can vote. However, there is a checkbox that notes that the voter is that the voting rights have been removed. We can go forward. If someone is under guardianship and they want to know whether they still have retained their voting rights, they should ask their guardian and to obtain a copy of that order. And that can be obtained through the probate court for a fee of $2 in their county. A person who has a guardianship and has lost the right to vote can petition to get it back under Wisconsin statute. And here's some resources for you all on from the Disability Vote page about guardianship and reinstating guardianship or voting rights. We can go forward. Again, I want to highlight some of the resources that Barbara and I have both mentioned already. The Disability Rights Wisconsin maintains a voter hotline at 844-DIS-VOTE or 844-347-8683. And the email is info@disabilityvote.org. And as Barbara noted, that phone number is answered year round and is really a critical phone number to get important questions answered, and or if you are having access barrier issues on voting day, to really go to what's the next step. The Disability Vote Coalition is available website, and also we are on Facebook, social media, and also Instagram. There is great information on guardianship and voting at the Disability Vote Coalition. Accessible voting in Wisconsin, available from the WEC, the Wisconsin Elections Commission, has quite a bit of information on their website about accessible voting. Additionally, they have a complaints page where we can file accessibility complaints. Really critical if you have an accessibility barrier to notify the Elections Commission so that we can support them in collecting important data that we can use in our advocacy work. The Americans with Disabilities Act and other federal laws regarding voting can be found on the ada.gov website. And we can find a list of all Wisconsin accessibility provisions at the link that Barbara has also included, and you will get these resources. And we can go forward. Just that gentle reminder to all of us to say it proud, say it loud, disability rights are civil rights. And with that, I am very pleased to turn the podium, the microphone, over to Scott.
Thank you very much, Denise. And thank you to the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County and the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. I'll just note that I recently moved, and it was a set of league volunteers at the farmers market who helped me register to vote. So I really do appreciate everything you guys do, and especially putting on this event tonight on such an important topic. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully not mess up the presentation. This is always a precarious moment. Give me 1 second. All right. Okay. So good evening, everybody. My name is Scott. I'm an attorney at Law Forward in Madison. Law Forward is a nonprofit law firm that focuses on advocacy in the courtroom and elsewhere to strengthen our democracy. So I've been with Law Forward for a year. Before I worked here, I was a civil rights attorney focusing a lot on police excessive force and other constitutional civil rights cases. So today I'm going to be talking about really the intersection between disinformation and policy, and really how how disinformation is really driving policy and what that means for, I think, specifically voters with disabilities here in Wisconsin. I think conversations about disinformation and problems in society can be a little bit depressing, frankly, but I'm hoping that we can leave this conversation a little bit uplifted, because I think we're finding ourselves with some success. And so what I want to do is use basically the last calendar year of my work dealing with litigation that involved drop boxes and absentee ballot return to kind of paint this picture really broadly. So what are we talking about? What are misinformation and disinformation? So I used a helpful slide from actually the League's national website that I think just makes it really clear. Misinformation is inadvertently sharing false information without the intent to harm. In other words, you hear something, you repeat it, and you might not necessarily know that it's not true. Disinformation is slightly different. It's intentionally sharing false information with the intent to harm, or at least intentionally sharing false information that you know could disrupt what folks understand about, specifically here, how our democracy is working. So I'm going to take everyone back a couple of years to September of 2020 for an example of how this sort of disinformation, misinformation chain can start. And so in September, in the city of Madison, there was a absentee ballot return event called Democracy in the Park. And all over the city, citizens had a really unique opportunity to return their absentee ballots really conveniently. As you can remember, at this point, there weren't vaccines. COVID was pretty rampant. A lot of things remained closed. And so these accessibility options were really important. However, that didn't stop people from misconstruing these events as somehow improper. For example, this tweet that I've selected, I think, is helpful in understanding really how this starts. It refers to Madison's quote unquote illegal ballot harvesting. And the clear intention of this message is to imply that something nefarious is going on, that there's a problem here that needs to be addressed. And really, that's not true. The truth is different. Our Supreme Court actually got to answer that specific question about democracy in the park. And sort of the swing vote on the Supreme Court, Justice Hagedorn, first ruled that the court couldn't really even answer the question, that the question had come to the court too late. But in a concurrence that he wrote, he said, "I see no basis to conclude the ballots collected at Democracy in the Park events were cast in contravention of Wisconsin law." In other words, that statement in the previous slide, that this was an illegal event, that's simply not true. And what else is not true? Let's just call it out. We know that post 2020, there has been a significant upturn in misinformation and disinformation more broadly about all sorts of allegations of voter fraud. And that's just not true. Although perhaps the most thoroughly investigated American election in history, there has been no evidence that there is any sort of widespread voter fraud. And in Wisconsin, there certainly is no evidence that there was widespread ballot harvesting that somehow influenced or corrupted our election. That's just not true. So what happens next in these sorts of disinformation cases? Well, what I believe is that they are driving changes in policy, and they're doing it in different ways. Barbara, in her piece, mentioned how there's been just a huge shift or a huge onslaught of bills, legislative bills, that have been brought into the legislature, and I think almost all in Wisconsin have been vetoed by the governor. But as a result, I think individuals who see the disinformation as an actual problem are using it to now try and change the law as if it gives them a reason to correct a problem that doesn't exist. And so that's what we had in a case called Tigan v. Wisconsin Elections Commission. This document you should be able to see on your screen is the first page of that lawsuit. And essentially this lawsuit was premised on ballot harvesting being a widespread problem in Wisconsin. And to address it, the plaintiffs sought to make both a ballot return assistance, which is what we refer to returning someone else's ballot, as well as drop boxes to render those things illegal. Now, to be clear, this was based on misinformation and disinformation. And I know this because I asked the plaintiffs if they had any idea if it was true, and they didn't. So for example, I asked Mr. Tigan, have you ever seen someone return a group of ballots, for example, to the clerk? He answered me, no. And then I asked him, now let me just ask you, have you ever seen any of the type of conduct that you suggest is illegal in your complaint? Have you ever seen it happen? No. Then I asked him, do you have any personal knowledge of any of that stuff ever happening? And he answered no. The other plaintiff, Mr. Tom, said the same. I asked him again, do you have any personal knowledge of anyone ever using a drop box or having a ballot returned by a third party? Answer, no. You don't know if it's ever happened. And then his answer to this question, I think, was really, really key. He says, well, democracy in the park. I'm guessing it happened. And so there you see that one of the plaintiffs in this case linked that misinformation that sprung up sort of late in the summer with the actual lawsuit he was bringing. And then I asked him again, but you don't really know, correct? And he answered, no, I wasn't there. And so what we were focused on, and really I'm not going to be talking too much about drop boxes today. I'm going to be focused on this absentee ballot return question. We were focused on, not to make this seem too obvious, but the return of absentee ballots. I think the earlier speakers pointed out that assistance to voters with disabilities is really widely available and is pretty specific in Wisconsin state statute. What is a problem in Wisconsin is that the state statutes are largely silent about that type of assistance for the return of an absentee ballot. What we're really working with is just 21 words. The envelope shall be mailed by the elector or delivered in person to the municipal clerk issuing the ballot or ballots. This is the only guidance that state statute gives us on how an absentee ballot is to be returned. And now I just want to point something out. Something that I struggled with when I was dealing with this case in the beginning was the word ballot or ballots. It seemed strange to me, and it seemed to imply that, you could certainly return more than one ballot. And I looked into it, and it's actually different. I found out that years and years and years ago, there actually used to be an individual ballot for each election. So in other words, if you were voting for your state representative, your state senator, a national senator, each election had its own ballot. So in other words, we're dealing with a statute that's frankly outdated, but at the very least doesn't really provide much to go on. So ballot return assistance for many people is just a matter of convenience, but for voters with disabilities, it's more significant than that. And that issue was at the center of the litigation in this Tigan case. In that case, full disclosure, Law Forward and I represented Disability Rights Wisconsin, as well as the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin and another organization called Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice. And one of the key arguments we were making is that ballot return assistance can't be just generally illegal. Because if that were true, if it were generally illegal, then a huge group of voters, voters with disabilities that rely on that assistance to return their absentee ballot would either, one, be unable to use Wisconsin's absentee ballot program, or two, wouldn't be able to vote at all. And in either way, you got a big problem. And so the case proceeded in the circuit court, and I made this point clear as I could to the judge. This is from our transcript from a hearing in January of early this year. What I said to the judge was, the undisputed record before the court on this question is that if the court were to rule either on the injunction or summary judgment, that a significant portion of Wisconsin's eligible voters would not be able to vote. And that's true. The only evidence in the record identified that making ballot return assistance illegal would essentially disenfranchise these voters. And to me, that seems like a quite compelling argument. But me being a lawyer and just saying what I think is very less persuasive, I think, than lifting up the voices of the actual individuals who deal with this. And so with the help of DRW, the League of Women Voters and others, we collected stories from voters with disabilities to just make sure the court understood how significant this was. And I just want to read a couple of those statements to the group here tonight. Here is one. I am a veteran receiving hospice support for a military-related terminal illness. I am unable to leave the house and voted by absentee ballot in the last several elections. I need assistance to fill out and mail the ballot. I am concerned that I will be unable to vote. Another one. I have been voting since I was 18. MS has taken away my ability to drive to a clerk or walk to my own mailbox. I'm barely able to sign my name anymore. I depend on my husband for essentially all my physical needs, and this ruling will disallow him from assisting me with one of my basic American rights, which I completely intend to do for the rest of my life. As a pastor of a diverse congregation in the Milwaukee area, I can share that this has caused great concern among my parishioners. An African-American and non-driver who relies upon others for transportation and delivery needs due to health concerns in the pandemic, as she votes by absentee ballot and relies upon trusted neighbors and friends to deliver her ballot. And so what we were trying to make really clear to the judge is that these are actual voters, people that have rights that would be disenfranchised. And frankly, this was probably the most inspiring part of the entire litigation for me, was seeing these voters very quickly over Martin Luther King Jr. holiday weekend fill out and sign an affidavit to submit to a court case to make sure their voices were heard. I think they provided a really important lesson to really everyone involved. And nevertheless, we heard crazy arguments on the other side. We were told that this wasn't a big deal, quote, that can be addressed separately in a bill by the legislature if there is some gap, or it could be addressed in a separate case if another party could identify such a situation. That's a lawyery way of saying this isn't a big deal and we don't think it's really a problem. That is the type of argument we heard from the other side in this case. And it was very frustrating and I think insulting for the rights of voters with disabilities to just be disregarded that way in open court. Well, ultimately, we lost at the circuit court. At the lower court, it ruled that ballot return assistance was just generally illegal, and also that drop boxes were illegal. We moved really quickly because that ruling happened in January, and we're able to get it stayed, meaning not really enforced for the moment, for a February primary election. So for that election, voters with disabilities and without were able to use ballot return assistance to return their ballot. But for the April election, that stay was lifted. And so what that meant is that a Waukesha County judge's ruling went into effect that on its face prohibited ballot return assistance for voters all over Wisconsin. So what happened? We know from statements made during an August 3rd meeting this summer that voters with disabilities were certainly disenfranchised during that April election. One of the commissioners, Bob Spindell, explained, we learned during the April election that there were a number of people with disabilities who were told by the clerk, no, you cannot have someone else drop this off for you. Those people did not have a chance to vote. And so this is significant. You know, I think it's important to pause and recognize that the state's oversight body for our elections recognized that the law prohibited voters with disabilities in some circumstances from voting in the April election. Really a significant harm that, in my opinion, really did not get the attention it deserved. So eventually this question makes its way to the Supreme Court. And technically the question is, was the lower court ruling, was that order, was it right? And so sadly, the 150 or so page decision of the Wisconsin Supreme Court didn't really give us clear answers to a lot of these questions. Some of the ruling, counteracted other parts of it. Some parts of the ruling were joined by a majority while other parts were not. But as to the question of ballot return assistance, it was murky at best. Again, the underlying order said that this type of assistance is just generally illegal. Some non-majority or 3 of the 4 justices, i.e. not actually law, some of those paragraphs indicated that only part of that underlying order was upheld. The part being only having to do with ballot return assistance when the ballot is delivered actually to the clerk's office. But other paragraphs didn't have that level of specificity and just said that that underlying order had been affirmed as a general matter. And yet still other paragraphs made it seem pretty clear that the court did not want to address the question of mailing a ballot through ballot return assistance at all. And then what did the court say about all these problems we had raised to it about voters with disabilities? It said not a lot. The court, in fact, just refused to address the question altogether. They said, as far as we can discern, as if this wasn't clear, DRW's argument largely rests on the practical impact of the circuit court's declarations on disabled voters who may be physically unable to vote if someone cannot place an absentee ballot in the mail on a voter's behalf. The court then went on to cite a couple of state statutes that have nothing to do with absentee ballot return assistance to say that, this was just no big deal. And this was really disheartening. I think it was a moment where the court, the highest law of the land of the state of Wisconsin, disregarded this key civil right. And like was said earlier, disability rights are civil rights, and it cannot be split any other way. And to hear that type of rejection was very disheartening. That being said, we had a plan that had actually been in motion for about 4 months in preparation that the Supreme Court was going to do exactly that, create a general rule that would prohibit this type of assistance. I'm going to skip that slide. So what can we do? What was the plan that we had? Well, as was discussed earlier, there's a set of really important federal laws that protect voters with disabilities, not only when they're voting, but broadly in society. The Voting Rights Act is a bit specific. It says in one particular provision, any voter who requires assistance to vote by reason of blindness, disability, or inability to read or write may be given assistance by a person of the voter's choice, other than the voter's employer or agent of that employer, or officer or agent of the voters' union. In other words, voters with disabilities who need it have a right to get help, a federal right. The Americans with Disabilities Act is actually much broader. It guarantees that Americans with disabilities have full and equal access to state programs. That's important, full and equal. So they can't, for example, be prohibited from participating in the absentee ballot process if they can still vote on election day. That would not be full, that would not be equal. In addition, the regulations that are associated with the ADA actually put affirmative obligations on state agencies to actually change what they do to accommodate voters with disabilities. So together, we knew that we had really good arguments that if the state of Wisconsin Supreme Court was going to generally make ballot return assistance illegal, that we could go back to court and fight on behalf of voters with disabilities to make sure that they could vote and make sure that they could get that assistance. So I think just 10 days after the Supreme Court decision in Tigan was issued, these 4 voters, who I think are all heroes, Tim Carey, Martha Chambers, Mike Reese, and Scott Luber, all stood up and volunteered to put their names on a federal lawsuit to fight back against what happened in the Supreme Court. And so they filed suit and argued essentially those points that I just made, that the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Voting Rights Act guarantee that they can get this assistance, and they need clarification before the November election. So just some key things to know about how this works. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution says that federal law, in essence, shall be the supreme law of the land. In other words, if there's any other dispute about what controls federal law gets the final say. Preemption is related to that Supremacy Clause issue. It's a concept that says when a state law comes in conflict with the federal law, the Supremacy Clause preempts it and makes that state law essentially invalid. And so that's what we were working with. We believe that to the extent the Supreme Court had prohibited ballot return assistance, it was preempted by the federal laws I just described, and that the Supremacy Clause would prohibit the state of Wisconsin from having such law on the books. So here's the quick timeline. July 8th, the Tigan opinion came out. July 10th, the Elections Commission met and actually decided not to address this issue of voters with disabilities. 4 days later, the administrator of the Elections Commission actually said that went beyond what Tigan held and said that the voter is the one who's required to mail the ballot. That mailing question was not addressed by Tigan. And then 8 days later, we filed our lawsuit. 5 days later, we moved the court for a preliminary injunction. And just to be absolutely clear, in about a month after the judge ruled on the case as a final matter, meaning the entire dispute was settled in about 7 weeks, a timeline that is sort of unprecedented for a lawsuit. And we won. We won in really important and significant fashion. Judge Peterson, who's a judge in the Western District, had some really, I think, just important things, important takeaways, big picture stuff about the situation. He framed the issue like this. So for these voters, do they violate the law by using assistance to vote absentee and risk having their vote thrown out, or worse, being sanctioned for violating the law? Do they try to vote in person, risking their health and safety, or do they give up their right to vote altogether? And he said, no way, no how, none of those things. That's not an option. This is also directly from what his opinion said. Voters shouldn't have to choose between exercising their federal rights and complying with state law. The Voting Rights Act is clear. Disabled voters who need assistance in returning an absentee ballot are entitled to ask a person of their choosing for that assistance. And then he said, in this case, the VRA applies with obvious clarity. Plaintiffs are entitled to use assistance when returning their absentee ballot. And so then he issued a final order that controls the law in Wisconsin and sends a message really to the rest of the country. For the specific plaintiffs, he said that they are qualified voters with disabilities who require assistance, and that under the Voting Rights Act, voters, and this is just said very generally, voters who require assistance with mailing or delivering their absentee ballot to the municipal clerk because of a disability are entitled to assistance by a person of their choice. And then he said, to the extent that the state statute prohibits that assistance, it is preempted by what is the Voting Rights Act. And then afterwards, he issued an injunction. He said that the Elections Commission and Megan Wolf, its administrator, are enjoined from enforcing that provision under the state laws by which the Election Commission hears complaints. In other words, after voters with disabilities had cast their ballots, the Elections Commission and the administrator could not interpret the way that they voted in any way that would be inconsistent with the Voting Rights Act. And then finally, also quite important, the judge ordered that the defendant, the Elections Commission, had about 9 days to give instructions to all of Wisconsin's 1,850 municipal clerks to clarify this issue really for everybody, that the Voting Rights Act requires that any Wisconsin voters who require assistance with mailing or delivering their absentee ballots because of a disability must be permitted to receive that assistance. In other words, he agreed with us. He disagreed with what the Supreme Court did. And now, as a result, we have really clear direction that voters in Wisconsin, voters with disabilities in Wisconsin, are entitled to the rights that they've really always had, or at least for the last 40 years or so, to use this assistance as they vote. And that's, I think, just a really important victory and something that makes me feel optimistic going forward that we do have these tools to use. We do have these federal laws for a reason, and they do make a difference. So just to bring this all full circle, I'm getting very boring. No one wants to hear me anymore. But this started with misinformation and disinformation. It started with tweets that misrepresented what was going on, that really triggered policy consequences. And I want you to know this is not just happening in Wisconsin. This issue about ballot return assistance has come up, has been actually successfully challenged in Indiana and North Carolina. There are also pending cases in Texas, Florida, and Georgia that I know of. There's almost certainly more. But what I think it shows is that as they pursue these extreme policies, voters with disabilities are being forgotten. Now, that doesn't mean that voters with disabilities aren't standing up for themselves. Those are two different things. And I think what this case shows is that voters with disabilities are not going to stand pat. They're not going to just be idle as their rights are taken away. They are going to stand up and do what it takes. My personal opinion is that this is ridiculous and that I should not have to do this. Voters with disabilities are frankly facing, challenges that no one deserves to face. But in the face of these problems, we can still win. And so that gives me hope. And I think we have left this whole confusing year of ballot return assistance in at least a slightly better place where we know that these voters can vote, which is good. Okay, I have been talking for far too long, and I am going to turn it over to Dorothy. And I would just like to say thanks to everybody for attending. Thanks again.
Thanks, Scott. I made some notes on what you were saying because there were things in there that are important, even though they're just a word or two. I'm looking at this from the position of political power, and that's as my experience as an advocate and also as an elected official. And what I see is that civic engagement is essential. It's part of what makes a democracy, and there's no question about that. Next slide. Okay, I think Barbara touched on this. Those yellow blocks represent the highlights of the year, which is voting. But there's a whole lot of activity that has to go on before and after, or voting is meaningless. We have lots of opportunities, but voting is a civic activity that we need to keep voting every election. But we also need to dip our toes into what we can do to maintain the momentum. And there's a strong momentum right now going in to the election coming up. And we need to figure out how to keep that going. So next slide. First thing, vote in every election. Now we have social media, which we should be able to use much more effectively. And Molly and I forget the other woman, did a presentation for the league on exactly how to use social media to expand the reach of the league. And that's certainly something that we all should look at in terms of the organizations we belong to, or just ourselves. We need to get information out to voters in advance. And that's something you can do through social media. You can do it through talking with friends, just mentioning, hey, have you registered yet? Things are a little bit more confusing this time. Find a better way to say it than that. But just that it's time to get registered. It's time to understand what your rights are. And there are organizations, there's a lot of organizations out there, and they will have information on what your rights are as a voter and what you need to do in order to get an ID. And I would say there's a couple of them. Legends, Supermarket Legends is one. It's a small one though, and it's not something everybody's going to be able to access. Other groups like Souls to the Polls, it's a network of people that are doing more than just driving people to the polls now because it's needed. They are expanding their network as well. Now, the things that probably are the most effective for the people that are here on this, Zoom, because they're here, they probably have already done all this stuff. Being an election observer is something that not only is it done by the state government through the Wisconsin Election Commission, and then through various municipalities and counties that send out people to look and see how valuable is this polling place? Is there enough room in here so that voters can actually vote with privacy? Is there enough light in here for people who need to be able to see the ballot very clearly? Is the accessible voter booth or the voting machine, is it actually set up, plugged in, and ready to go? Believe it or not, that doesn't happen all the time. Election observers are really important people, especially because there are other folks with very specific agendas who are going to be election observers this fall. And we need to have people who don't come in with a pre-assigned agenda, but who come in with the belief that every person with a legal right, with the constitutional right to vote, should be able to vote. They should be able to do it privately. They should be able to do it effectively. They should be able to do it with no sweat, and they should not be intimidated. That brings me to the group Wisconsin Election Protection. The Wisconsin Election Protection is another good group to keep their phone number in your pocket, whether you're an election observer or not. They will help answer questions. And as Barbara mentioned, and I know the league also, because I've staffed the phone on election day, many organizations, and you go for the reputable ones because there have been so many changes. Since 2011, there have been 61 changes, legislative changes in our voting process and our voting requirements. Things like the ID, never had that before. That is something that has created ongoing confusion and still creates confusion. So we need to know which are the places that we should be contacting. And Disability Vote Coalition is also another one. Keep those phone numbers handy. Give them to your friends. If anybody asks them any questions prior to the election, the more information you can get out to people, the better. Being a poll worker is on here because it's definitely something that you want to do if you're not already a poll worker. But I wanted to mention that when I was doing observing and there were no voters in the place so that I could actually talk with some of the workers briefly, they told me that they hate those folding chairs and those plastic chairs because, quite frankly, like me, they are old and some of them have pretty severe arthritis. It's very hard sitting there all day, and it's very hard getting up and down from those chairs. And that's another thing, that when election observers go to do the observing, it's also a good idea to talk to the people that are not just the voters, and maybe talk to some of the staff outside of the room. You cannot really in any way, shape, or form intervene in the voting process, but you can certainly talk to people when they're not doing their jobs, like the poll workers. They get breaks. Okay, next slide. Now, this is what most networks look like. Messy, and some of these webs go nowhere, and some of these webs hook up with a lot of others. And what I encourage people to do, and this really comes out of being an elected official, at least know what networks exist in your community. Know what sorts of organizations there are. Pick an issue that interests you. Pick a couple of them. Get on mailing lists. If there's a telephone tree to tell you about stuff that's coming up, get on that. But it's these different pieces of the network. Those are all things that are important. And quite frankly, if we don't take the steps to make sure that democracy is functioning the way it should, which means our voices are in there too, just like everyone else, we're going to have a limping, unhealthy democracy. And it's not something that even requires that you get heavily involved in something that's sort of, maybe off the beaten track. Maybe you've never done any sort of looking into conservation issues, or say the PFAS or water issues, clean water in Wisconsin. Get on a mailing list, find out more about it, find out what sorts of legislation is coming up and what sorts of legislation is being proposed. And I've focused it on legislation because a policy alone is not enough, because until it's actually codified into law, it's worthless. It's like the obligatory proclamations on July 26th every year for 30 years at least, saying we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. Isn't that wonderful? Americans with Disabilities Act shows what what our society is like. It shows what we're like as human beings, but it does not actually put anything into effect. It's nice words, but it's not enough. And we need to go to the next step. And the next step is understanding we need to take our power and use it. So let's see. I think, yeah, next slide. These are things that just about anybody can do, and have a relative do it. I mean, I keep other people in my family informed, and they say, it's really great that you're doing this because I don't have time. And I keep saying to them, you really got to check this out, because you and I do not agree politically, but you still vote for all the people I suggest. That's fine. I like it, but I think they really should make their own choices. But we need to be very much aware that we need to build that power so that at some point we are in the position, and we will build towards that. And it's being built now. We have to be in the position where we can begin rolling back those 61 pieces of legislation. I listened, about the signature. There never was a signature before. That's a way to slow the process down, to cause backups in the line, to force the poll workers to work even harder. And that has not actually done anything to change any kind of illegal activity. It hasn't. And why are we doing it? Well, we're doing it because it's a voter suppression law. And I would mention too, we need to be aware of the elections, and in between the elections, getting involved with as many organizations as we're interested in, just to get a feed on the information. And you don't have to be involved in all of them. I mean, just find one or two that you really like and do that. I mean, there's all kinds of things, transit riders, Girl Scouts, 9 to 5, organizations that have affiliated groups like the Parks people in Milwaukee County. It's important to make sure that that sort of activity goes on, so that at some point we will be able to block legislation like some legislation that was proposed during the last administration by Representative Glenn Grothman and Representative Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin. Their legislation would have made life more difficult for people with disabilities. I won't go into it now. It's another one of those things. And we could see all that stuff happening, and it is still going to happen, where there will be legislation again coming up that will, and both in the state and in Congress, to try to limit and box in people with disabilities. And now we have long COVID sufferers. That is bringing in another, a few 100,000, I think. I'm not real sure of the numbers. I don't want to give out disinformation or misinformation, Scott. But there's going to be statewide, there are going to be at least 100,000 people who acquire disabilities through COVID. And a lot of those people have no idea that they are covered by the ADA, which President Biden did announce. Not all the conditions are for all the programs, but those folks also, and I look at it in terms of myself. I've got the experience, I've got the contacts, I've got a stable life, and I have disabilities. So I want more people like me who can then in turn educate other people around us, both people with disabilities, people without disabilities, people who don't have them now, who may have them in the future, but to talk very realistically about public policy of inclusion. And that's why I founded Disability Justice. Because if we had a society that truly was an inclusive society, it would be like the air we breathe. And there would be no question about the accessibility of polling places. That everyone would notice it. And it's the same thing. Well, like with Representative Anderson. Representative Anderson was told he could not join meetings of a committee that he sat on in the legislature because he wanted to do it by phone. And he had every legal right under federal law to have that accommodation, especially because the Wisconsin Senate does it. But everybody got it wrong. Everybody said, oh, this is an employment thing. It's an employment accommodation. Well, his check is signed by the state of Wisconsin, not by the Speaker of the legislature. So that all got confused. And what we should be able to say is, oh, this is not an issue because everybody knows that he has the right to do this. If this was an inclusive society, and it would be the same about the polling places. Somebody would say, oh, wait a minute, we have to fix this. That doesn't happen right now all the time, but it will. And that's the direction I'm moving. And one of the things somebody told me to mention was pickleball. Pickleball, I don't have a clue how it's played. I don't have a clue whether you use a real pickle, but it's supposed to be a big hot topic right now. And it's supposed to be good for seniors and for all kinds of other people. So maybe that's what we all should do, is we should start a pickleball league. I don't know. Anyway, what we need to do, we need to constantly focus on power, accumulating power. And you do that by accumulating people and changing minds and increasing that power, because you have an issue that is current, that is definitely needed, that is just morally right, ethically right. And we have a law, despite the fact that after 30 years, we don't really have much in the way of an inclusive society. And I really believe firmly that we can use the Americans with Disabilities Act, enforcing Title II. Title II mandates that government entities and all public entities must comply with the ADA. Well, it doesn't happen. It hasn't happened. That's why there is still a law. Well, there's one that I know of, and I'm sure there's more. There's a law in our statutes that violates the ADA. And I have been trying to get someone to take it seriously, and I have not gotten a decent response from anybody. I got a letter from the Department of Safety and Professional Services basically saying, oh, we think inclusion is a great idea, but we do it differently. Well, okay, that's what, separate but equal, which was thrown out by the Supreme Court in 1954, and also said, we're going to continue doing this. And they call it an ADA exemption. The state of Wisconsin has absolutely no business telling municipalities or anybody else that they can get an ADA exemption in this specific instance. It's not across the board. I don't want to go into it. It's been a long battle. But anyway, that's the kind of thing that should not still be happening after 30 years. We need an overarching policy, and we need to be able to say, here are the things we do now, which are not done now. Like, I'll give you one example. One example is every time the state of Wisconsin asks for bids on a project, whether it's a program or a project, bricks and mortar thing. They must include in that request for a bid that Title II has to be taken into account by the vendor, by whoever responds to that. We don't have anything like that right now. So that means that nobody in the state of Wisconsin government thinks that's important, which of course it is. And the larger business community, they are not being told, you have to learn what Title II is. You have to learn that the ADA is a civil rights law, and it's a law that demands inclusion. It demands it. And I think if we use the ADA and do it by causing the government to take those kinds of actions, it'll get attention. And we'll be able to educate journalists, judges, legislators, the public, everybody. And we look at the intersections of what about women with disabilities? What about people of color and disabilities? And I think it all can be done through the ADA. And that is why I founded Disability Justice about 4 years ago. And that's why we're working on the things we're working on. And one of the things we're working on, and then I'll stop because I'm watching the clock. One of the things we're working on is coming up with a model ordinance for every single county and municipality in the state of Wisconsin. And that ordinance would say more than just the platitudes. Isn't it wonderful we have an ADA? It shows how much we care about people with disabilities. It's going to have some very concrete, specific things. And we're gonna go around the state and we are going to get that thing passed by as many municipalities as we can get. The person who's writing it is an attorney with experience as a public defender, as a state senator, and as a city of Milwaukee alderman. So he and I have been talking about public policy issues that are critical if we're going to make that happen. But through that process, we will be educating a lot of people about what the ADA is, what it means, and what it means to have an inclusive society. So thanks for the opportunity, League of Women Voters. Notice I had you in here as something to join. I've been a member for a long time.
Thank you, Dorothy. And yes, I did notice that. We have 3 questions. For Denise first, does a person with a visual impairment need 2 poll workers to oversee the voters' choice as they mark the ballot, sort of as a check and balance?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Currently, no. When the poll worker, when the voter with disabilities asks for assistance, whether they're blind or have any other disability that requires assistance, it is a single assister that that supports the voter.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
And Barb, if a court has taken away someone's voting rights, is that communicated to the Wisconsin Elections Commission?
Well, this is Barbara. Thank you for that question. Like so much in the disability world, I would say it depends. So courts currently report to the Wisconsin Election Commission when individuals have lost the right to vote. However, no reports are required when, first of all, people have only guardianships of the estate, because that doesn't result in the loss of the right to vote. When people have a limited guardianship of the person and the court has determined they retain the right to vote. And finally, when people have lost the right to vote but have never registered to vote. A lot of individuals who have guardianships and have lost the right to vote, it's a young person and their parents are concerned about them, so they put a guardianship in place. The young person is 18, they've never voted. So there's nothing in place in terms of their registration to vote. So in a case like that, they would not receive a report about that.
Okay, thank you. And Scott, one for you. Could the Wisconsin Supreme Court have ruled that the state law was unclear regarding the return of absentee ballots by persons other than the voter, but that the Federal Voting Rights Act requires that Wisconsin allow absentee voters to use assistance? Or is the Wisconsin Supreme Court not allowed to take notice of federal law?
They certainly can take notice of federal law, and we really encouraged them to do that. It was the consistent argument of Disability Rights Wisconsin, the League of Women Voters, and our other intervener, that it would be absurd to construe a Wisconsin law in a way that would infringe on a federal law, because then these voters would have to go sue to fix it. But the Supreme Court didn't want to listen to me, didn't want to listen to us. And so we had to do that. But yes, they could have, but no, they didn't. And I'll be candid that I thought they were going to. I really thought that, we prepared for months as like a worst case scenario thing that ended up happening. But I really thought that there was going to be a sentence in that opinion that was going to say, of course, voters with disabilities have a right to assistance. It's been federal bedrock civil rights law for 50 years, but they didn't do that. And so that's why we had to go to federal court.
Thank you. And there's one more that came in along with an answer from Dorothy. The question was, with this state of Wisconsin so-called exemption from the ADA, has there been litigation in federal court for ADA compliance? And Dorothy responded, I've considered it. It costs about $20,000 to initiate a lawsuit in federal court.
Peggy, if I could.
Yeah.
I went in rather naively, assuming that, assuming I would find somebody who would understand. And I tried the department. I gave them suggestions on how they could make other parts of their procedures and stuff more compliant with the ADA, but got nowhere. I keep working up the food chain. I have tons of paper, and I filed complaints because the city of Burlington is involved in this too. The city of Burlington Common Council voted to approve the ADA exemption. That's just amazing to me. And their city attorney said it was okay to do that. He wrote it. I mean, I'm very good at creating a paper trail. So I have stuff on video and I have paper. I just don't have $20,000. And I had really been hoping that this was something that could be taken care of 3 years ago when I first brought it up. It costs a lot of money. And I thought this was all very simple. Let's talk about the Constitution and the Supremacy Clause. Didn't work. I have opinions from a couple of attorneys. Didn't even look at them. I have plenty of stuff, but I did file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Justice. And the U.S. Department of Justice finally sent a reply. And the reply said, we're not going to take it up. We're not going to investigate. But they did have 2 sentences which said basically what the Supremacy Clause says. So the next step would be what I'm doing, which is I don't have $20,000, and neither does anybody else with the organization have $20,000. What I'm doing is I'm beginning to write material and post it. Twitter, Medium, Daily Costs, and wherever else I can find it. More or less like a blog. And I use the names of 2 people and I have backup for all this. I'm very careful about it. I have backup for the people's names I mentioned. 2 state employees and the city attorney from Burlington. And sooner or later, Google will pick up their names, and sooner or later, I look at that in the situation with the websites. Over 40 departmental websites for the state of Wisconsin were not and may still not be accessible. And nothing happened until the media picked it up. So I'm at the point now, it's been 3.5 years, and I really want to stay away from that. And I'm not going to anymore. I'm going to use what I've got, the paper trail I've created, and I'm going to start saying, this is what these people are doing. And this doesn't make any sense. And is this any way to run a government? Anyway, I talk too much.
Oh, hooray for your persistence. A recording of this program will be on the State League of Women Voters website, along with all of the resources in the chat and more valuable resources beyond that. So their website is my.lwv.org/Wisconsin. Thank you to all of our panelists and to the audience for joining us tonight. There's a lot of valuable information. Everyone, please spread the word and please help your neighbors and friends get out the vote, and let's make democracy work. Thank you and good night.